She died on the delivery table at 32 years old. 3 healthy babies, 1 devastated family, and a husband who was already texting another woman in the hallway while the doctors were still fighting to save her. Within a week, that woman was sleeping in her bed. Within 3 weeks, she was holding her babies, posting pictures of her shoes online, calling herself their mother. Everyone thought he'd won. Everyone except Colleen. Because 8 weeks before she died, while she was still painting the nursery, still folding tiny blankets, still drawing little purple hearts on her ultrasound pictures, she had already hidden something. A manila envelope taped to the back wall of a closet, with 2 words on the front, for Mom. Inside that envelope was a letter, a USB drive, bank records, text messages going back 2 years, and a note that said, "Mom, if you're reading this, I was right. Don't let him take my babies." She knew, she prepared, and from beyond the grave, she won. This story will remind you that a mother's love doesn't end when her heart stops beating. It builds walls that outlast her. If this moved you, hit that like button right now and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment, I want to know. Did you see the ending coming? Because trust me, there's a twist that changes everything.
I wasn't there, but the head doctor, Nina Prescott, told me everything later. She said her voice was steady when she called for the crash cart, but her hands wouldn't stop trembling. She'd delivered over 2,000 babies in her career and never lost a mother. She told me she refused to let my Colleen be the first. All the machines were screaming, you see. She said it's a sound that gets in your bones and stays there forever. The nurses were a whirlwind of blue uniforms and latex gloves, trying to stop the bleeding, checking the IVs, calling out numbers. And there was my Colleen, just 32, 8 months along with triplets. Her hair was damp with sweat, and her lips were so pale. In her hand, she was clutching a little photo, the ultrasound picture of her 3 babies. She'd drawn little purple hearts around each one. Those 3 hearts were everything she fought for. Her eyes fluttered open one last time. She looked right at Dr. Prescott, and her voice was just a breath of air. "Tell them I wanted them," she whispered. "Every single day." Then she was gone. The cart was there, and Dr. Prescott did everything she could. For 11 minutes, she fought. 11 minutes that must have felt like a lifetime. And while she fought for Colleen, the surgical team delivered the babies. Margot was first, then Bridget, and then little Theodore. All of them breathing, all of them screaming, taking their very first gulps of air. The sounds of new life, so raw and beautiful. But their mother was silent. Dr. Prescott finally stepped away from the table, pulled off her gloves, and looked at the clock. It was 9:47 at night. She told me she'd never forget that time. "Time of death," she said, her voice cracking just a little. 9:47 p.m. And the room, she said, fell quiet. Not completely silent, of course. Machines beeped, babies cried. But the people, they went still. It's the kind of quiet that falls when something is broken for good. Out in the hallway, her husband, Grant Ashford, was leaning against the wall. He wasn't pacing or praying. He was on his phone, the screen lighting up his face as he texted someone. A nurse came out, her face streaked with tears. She tried to get his attention, said his name, but he didn't even look up. He just held up a finger, that universal sign for just a minute. When she said his name a 3rd time, "Mr. Ashford, you need to come in." He finally looked up, slipped his phone in his pocket, and followed her. He didn't ask a single question. He didn't hurry. He just walked. The babies had already been taken to the NICU. 3 little bundles in their hospital blankets, Margot in pink, Bridget in yellow, and Theodore in blue. They were tiny, but doing well. Fighters, the nurses called them, just like their mother. Grant stood there, looking at them in their little boxes. "All 3 are healthy?" he asked the nurse. She nodded. "Good," he said. "That's good. He didn't ask about Colleen. Not once, not until Dr. Prescott came and told him directly. And even then, he was so controlled. He just closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose, breathing out slowly, like a man who'd just heard about a bad business deal. Was it the hemorrhage? He asked. Dr. Prescott explained it was a placental abruption, that they did all they could. He nodded a couple of times, ran a hand through his hair. The babies are okay, though, he said, more of a statement than a question. The babies are stable. He breathed out again. Okay, I need to make some calls. Then he just turned and walked away. He pulled his phone out right there in the hall. The call was so quick, just 3 seconds to dial. Not like a man searching for a contact in a daze, but like someone who had the number ready. It's me, he said. She's gone. Come to the hospital, but wait until morning. I'll text you. After he hung up, he just stood there for a moment under those awful, buzzing lights. He put his phone away, straightened his collar, and walked back to the NICU. And only then did he finally try to look like a grieving husband. I got there at 11:23 that night. I'd driven 4 hours in a terrible rainstorm ever since I got the call that her water broke 6 weeks early. I just threw some things in a bag and drove. No music, no food, just me and the rain, and a prayer repeating in my head. I walked onto that maternity floor expecting to finally hold my grandbabies. I was 61 then, with silver hair and hands that had seen a lot of work. I'd raised 2 children, all by myself after my husband passed, worked 2 jobs for 15 years. I thought I could handle anything life threw at me. I was so ready to be a grandmother, but a hospital chaplain was waiting for me by the nurse's station. The moment I saw him and the look on the nurse's face, I knew. A mother always knows. No, was all I could say. Just that one word. The chaplain started talking, using those gentle, practiced words for telling someone the worst news imaginable. I couldn't hear him. All I heard was the blood pounding in my ears and the hum of the lights. Then I heard a baby crying down the hall, and I knew it was one of mine, crying for a mother who would never come. I just sat down. Right there on the cold tile floor of the hallway, I covered my face, and a sound came out of me that wasn't even a word. It wasn't a scream. It was something deeper, something ancient that comes from a place inside a mother you hope you never have to find. The sound of a heart actually breaking. A nurse knelt by me. Someone else brought me water. Grant showed up at the end of the hall and came over. He put a hand on my shoulder. I'm so sorry, Dot, he said, his voice so even, so rehearsed. She fought so hard. The babies are healthy. She would want us to focus on that. I looked up at him. Through all the tears and the anger and this grief that felt big enough to swallow the whole world, and looking at my son-in-law, something flickered inside me. I couldn't name it then, but it felt like a warning. I let them help me up. I wiped my face and asked to see my grandchildren. The NICU was so warm and quiet, with just the soft, rhythmic beeping of the machines. I went to Margot's little isolette first. She was so impossibly tiny. 5 pounds, 2 ounces. She already had a little bit of dark hair, and she had Colleen's nose, that same little tilt at the end. My hands were shaking too much, so a nurse helped me reach in and touch her. Just my finger against her tiny hand. Her little fingers curled right around mine. I know it was just a reflex, but it felt like a message from Colleen, like she was reaching out to me, saying, I'm still here, Mom. I stood there for what felt like forever. I touched each of them, Margot, Bridget, and Theodore, memorizing every little thing about them. I stayed until the nurses said I should get some rest, but I couldn't. I just went to the waiting room and sat there, staring at a wall. At some point, I got up to get a drink, and through the window, I could see the parking garage. And there, in the yellow light, was Grant, standing by his car. He wasn't by himself, you know. I saw a woman standing with him, young, dark hair, lipstick so red you could see it, even in the dark. She was holding his hand, her head resting on his shoulder. And he just let her. No pushing away, no tears. I was just standing there at the window, and I remember squeezing a paper cup of water until it burst. I didn't even feel the water running down my fingers, dripping onto the floor. I just watched them until she finally walked to her own car, until Grant fixed his tie and headed back inside. I sat back down, put that ruined cup on the table, and folded my hands in my lap. I didn't sleep a wink that night, but that's when I started making a plan. The funeral was that Thursday. White lilies everywhere at the First Presbyterian, and 300 people packed in the pews. The casket was closed. I insisted. I couldn't stand the idea of all those people staring at my daughter's face, whispering how peaceful she looked. As if there's anything natural about that. The church just smelled of flowers and candle wax, and that faint, heavy scent of too many people in one room. The sun streamed through the stained glass windows, making these beautiful, colored patterns on the floor. Red, blue, gold. It was almost cruel how pretty it was. The light didn't care one bit that Colleen was gone. Grant stood up there at the podium in a dark suit, navy, not black, I remember that, with a silver tie. His hair was perfectly combed, but his eyes were red. He had a piece of paper in his hands, and he unfolded it so slowly. He looked out at everyone and said, "Colleen was the light of my life." His voice cracked just a little on the word light. You could feel 300 people lean in, their hearts just breaking for him. She was the most generous, the most loving, the most selfless woman I have ever known, he went on. She gave everything to our family. She fought for them until her last breath. That's what he said she was. A fighter, a mother, his best friend. He stopped for a moment, pressing his lips together and looking down. When he looked up, tears were on his cheeks. "I don't know how to do this without her," he whispered. "But I know she would want me to try. For Margot, for Bridget, for Theodore. For our family," he finished and stepped down. People clapped softly. Some even stood up, giving him an ovation for his grief. I stayed right there in the front pew. No applause from me. I just sat with my hands folded, my back straight, staring at nothing. All I could think about was that parking garage and that woman with the red lipstick holding my son-in-law's hand just 4 hours after my daughter had died. Fletch, Colleen's older brother, sat next to me. He's 35, built like a brick house, this Sam, with these huge hands. He hadn't said a single word since he'd flown in from Portland. He just sat there, staring at Grant, the muscles in his jaw clenching like he was chewing on rocks. I leaned over and whispered so only he could hear, "I'm not crazy. Something is wrong with that man." Fletch didn't say anything, but I saw his hands tighten into fists on his knees. It turned out your aunt had called him, too, 6 weeks before, crying, but she'd hung up before she could tell him why. At the back of the church, a woman was signing the guest book. She wrote her name so carefully, Vivian Holloway, close family friend. She was in a fitted black dress, expensive looking, and her lipstick was bright red. The kind of red that doesn't apologize for being there. It says, "I've arrived, and I'm not hiding." She sat way in the back, and I never saw her shed a tear. She just watched Grant give his speech, with this look I couldn't quite place at the time. Now I know what it was. Pride, patience, a sense of ownership, like watching an investment finally pay off. After, at the reception, everyone brought food, casseroles and cold cuts, all the things people bring when they don't know what to say. I stood by a window, getting hugs and hearing the same things over and over. She's in a better place. She's watching over you. Time heals. But time doesn't heal, honey. It just carves out a bigger space inside you to hold the pain. That's when Jolene Marsh, Colleen's best friend, found me by the coffee. They'd been best friends since they were in 7th grade. Jolene was 34, with freckles and red hair, and her eyes had been swollen for 3 days. "Dot," she said, grabbing my arm, "I have to tell you something." She told me Colleen had called her about 8 weeks before the delivery. She'd said something that sounded so strange at the time. She said if anything happened to her during the birth, Jolene had to check the closet in the nursery, behind the baby blankets. She repeated it twice. Jolene said she'd laughed it off. But Colleen hadn't been joking. The noise in the room just vanished when she told me that. "The nursery closet?" I asked. Jolene nodded. "Behind the baby blankets." She was very specific. I tucked that piece of information away. I didn't run home, didn't show any emotion. I just nodded, squeezed her hand, and thanked her. At 61, I'd learned one thing for sure. When you know you're being watched, you never, ever show your hand. And I was being watched. Grant's mother, Laurel, stood across the room, 67, perfect silver hair, and always wearing her pearls. She hadn't said a word to me since the hospital. Not one. No condolences, no questions about the babies. She just stood there with her friends, watching me the way a hawk watches a field mouse. It was only 3 days after the funeral that I started noticing things. Grant never got up for the night feedings. The nanny, a woman named Tessa, who, I later found out, was Vivian's college roommate, did everything. Grant had hired her within 72 hours of Colleen's death, without a word to me. In that same 72 hours, he'd called the life insurance company, canceled Colleen's club membership, taken her name off their bank account, and donated all her clothes to Goodwill. He didn't ask me or Fletch if we wanted anything. Not a single keepsake for the babies. I didn't say a word. I just wrote it all down. Dates, times, every little detail. In a small notebook I kept in my purse. It was the same purse Colleen had given me for Mother's Day 2 years earlier. It was leather, brown, with a little monogram on the clasp, DB, for Dorothy Brennan. On the 4th night, I heard something over the baby monitor. I was in the guest room, and the monitor was on my nightstand. Through the static, I heard a voice. It wasn't the nanny. It was younger, smooth, like honey. "Soon," it said, "this will all be ours, baby. Just a little more patience." I sat straight up in bed, just staring at that little green light pulsing on the monitor. Then there was silence. The next morning, I found a sympathy card on the kitchen counter. It wasn't with the others. It was just sitting by the coffee maker. White lilies on the front. Inside, someone had written, "To my love, the hardest part is over. Now we begin, V." I read it twice, put it back exactly where I found it, and poured my coffee. I walked to the window and just looked outside. It was the fact that they hadn't even bothered to hide it. That's what really chilled me to the bone. That kind of arrogance, that certainty that no one would notice or care, that the grieving old grandmother was too broken to see what was right in front of her. They were so wrong. I took my coffee out to the garage and got into Colleen's car, a white Honda Accord. I didn't start it. I just sat there. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw all the little things she'd left behind. Sunglasses, a half-empty water bottle, a prenatal vitamin stuck to the console, a hair tie on the gear shift. I could still smell her vanilla lotion. My daughter had been right there, in that seat, alive, driving to appointments, singing to the radio, resting her hand on her belly, feeling her 3 babies kick. I gripped that steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I didn't cry. The anger was better than the grief right then. Anger gives you something to do. Grief just pins you down. I sat in that car for 45 minutes. By the time I got out, my coffee was cold, but my mind was clear. I poured that terrible tea right down the garage drain. Then I walked back inside, put on a brave face, you know. I smiled at the nanny, gave each of my grandbabies a kiss on the forehead, and I even complimented Grant on a breakfast he didn't make. It's funny, the little lies you tell to keep the peace. Later that evening, when the house was finally still and Grant had shut himself in his study, I tiptoed into the nursery. I knelt down in front of the closet, pushed aside a stack of baby blankets, and found it, exactly where your mother said it would be, a manila envelope, taped to the back wall. It smelled like baby powder and lavender. Her handwriting was on the front, just two simple words. For Mom. I hugged that envelope to my chest and just breathed for a moment. I couldn't open it there, not in that house. That man down the hall was probably already texting the woman who signed funeral books with red lipstick. I tucked it into my jacket, fixed the blankets just so, and turned out the light. I knew I had to read it somewhere safe, a place Grant Ashford would never dream of looking. I ended up at the public library on Maple Street, of all places. I pulled the car under a streetlight, locked the doors, and killed the engine. For a minute, I just stared at that envelope sitting on the passenger seat. It looked so heavy, you know? Like the weight of your mother's final thoughts was pressing into the leather. My hands trembled as I tore it open. Inside, there were 5 things. First, a letter, handwritten, 8 pages, front and back. It was her neat paralegal handwriting, where every word was perfectly clear. Then there was a tiny USB drive taped to an index card. She'd written, "Everything is on here, dates, recordings, financial records, give to Emmett." There was also a copy of a phone bill, not ours, a separate one in Grant's name. It showed hundreds of calls and texts to a single number, day after day, sometimes 20 times a day. And finally, there were screenshots, printed on photo paper, of text messages between Grant and Vivian that went back a full 2 years. There were messages of affection, messages making plans, messages about a future that clearly didn't include my Colleen. And tucked inside was a small, folded piece of notepaper. It said, "Mom, if you're reading this, I was right. Don't let him take my babies. The drive has everything." I must have read that little note 3 times before I set it down. Then I picked up the letter. Under that dim, yellow streetlight, it felt like I could hear Colleen's voice in every single word. It wasn't the voice of a paranoid woman or some hormonal pregnant lady like they wanted me to believe. It was the voice of my daughter, who had spent months carefully piecing together the truth. The letter started so simply. "Mom," it said, "I know how this looks. A pregnant woman being paranoid. That is what Grant says. That is what his mother says. But I am not paranoid. I found the texts. I saw the photos. He has been with her for 2 years. The whole time they were trying for you babies, going to clinics, whoa, he was with her." My hands were shaking so hard, I had to press the paper against the steering wheel to keep reading. I found a hotel receipt 5 months into the pregnancy. Can you imagine? It was tucked in his coat pocket. A room at the Winslow Hotel, charged to his personal credit card. The receipt even listed rose petals and champagne, 2 glasses. I was at home, so sick I could barely eat saltine crackers, and he was off drinking champagne with her. She wrote that she confronted him, of course. And he denied everything. He told her she was being hormonal, that the pregnancy was making her irrational. He even suggested she see a therapist. He tried to make her believe she was the one with the problem. The letter just went on and on. Colleen described finding a second phone in his gym bag, seeing credit card bills for dinners and jewelry I knew she'd never received. She even found another woman's earring in his car. She finally hired a private investigator, paying him with her own savings, and he confirmed it all. The woman was Vivian Holloway, a 29-year-old real estate agent. They'd been seeing each other for at least 2 years. But the part of the letter that made it hard to breathe came near the end. "Mom," she wrote, "I am not writing this because I think I am going to die. I am writing this because Grant has been asking about my life insurance policy. He'd asked about it 3 times in 2 weeks. He wanted to know how much it was worth, when it would pay out. He even asked if there were exclusions for complications during childbirth. And then," she said, "last Thursday, he asked Dr. Prescott if complications during triplet deliveries were common. She said he asked it so casually, like he was just checking the weather. I had to put the letter down then. I just stared out at that dark library, my breath fogging up the window. My heart was pounding in my ears. After a moment, I picked it up again. I changed my will. I did it 3 weeks ago. Emmett helped me. If something happens to me, the house goes to you. The savings go into a trust for the babies. Grant gets nothing." I know that sounds harsh, but a man who asks about his pregnant wife's life insurance policy 3 times in 2 weeks does not deserve her money. He does not deserve her children. I remember those words so clearly. "I hope you never read this letter," she wrote. "I hope I'm being paranoid. I hope I come home with 3 healthy babies and burn this envelope and laugh about it someday. But if I don't, then you have everything you need. Fight for them, Mom, like you fought for me and Fletch after Dad died. You are the strongest person I know. You are the only person I trust. I love you. Now go be their grandmother. Your collie." I folded the letter back up along its original creases and just held it. The parking lot was so quiet then, just the hum of the streetlight and a distant train horn that sounded so lonely. I didn't cry. I was past crying. I was in that place where grief turns into something else, something sharp and focused. I looked at everything she'd gathered. The drive, the bills, the photos. "Your mother had been a paralegal for 6 years before she met Grant. She knew exactly how to build a case. She knew you needed proof. That documentation is what wins a fight. That envelope was perfectly organized, with little colored tabs and a table of contents on a sticky note. Blue for financial records, red for texts, green for the investigator's report, yellow for the will. Even while she was terrified, carrying the 3 of you, with her husband lying to her face, your mother was methodical. She was getting ready for a war." I started the car and drove straight to Emmett Calloway's house. It was after 10 at night, but I didn't care. I didn't even call. I just parked in his driveway, walked up to his door, and knocked, holding that manila envelope that held all of your mother's courage. Emmett, your mom's godfather, opened the door. He was in a cardigan, with reading glasses on. He was 45 then, with that calm way about him. He'd known Colleen her whole life. He taught her how to ride her first bike, you know. He gave her that first paralegal job at his firm. And he was the one who helped her change her will just 3 weeks before she died. He took one look at my face, then at the envelope in my hands, and just stepped aside to let me in. We sat at his kitchen table until 2 in the morning. Emmett went through every single page. He plugged in the USB drive and looked at the financial records, the phone logs, the investigator's photos. He read the text messages. I remember there was one in particular that made him stop, take off his glasses, and just stare. It was from Grant to Vivian, sent 4 months before you were all born. "Once the babies are born and everything settles, we will be free. She will sign whatever I put in front of her. She always does." Emmett looked at me and said, so quietly, he was planning this. He was planning to take everything from her. I just nodded. I already knew. I'd known since I saw that red lipstick in the funeral guest book. "What do we do?" I asked him. He closed the laptop and just looked at me. His godchild was gone. "You know, my darling, the woman he let die. I'd watched her grow from a little girl with a gap in her teeth to a brave and thoughtful young woman. And the man who was meant to be her rock was already thinking about her life insurance. I remember telling myself, we do exactly what Colleen would have wanted. We fight. Just 2 weeks after we buried her, Grant told me to leave. He did it over breakfast. Scrambled eggs, toast, and that glass pitcher of orange juice. The one your mother and I found at a market in Vermont. I can still see her holding it up to the sun, admiring the colors. And there he was, pouring juice from it, like it was just some cheap thing with no story. "Dot," he said in that gentle, practiced voice he had, "I think it's time for you to go home. The babies need a routine, and you've been, well, a bit disruptive." I just put my fork down. I looked right at him. "Disruptive?" I asked. He claimed the nanny said I hovered over the babies, that I came in at odd hours and threw off the schedule. He was just thinking of them, he said. "What's best for them is their grandmother," I told him. His smile, oh, it got just a little bit tighter. Most people wouldn't have seen it, but I did. He thanked me for everything I'd done, but said it was his home, his children, and he needed to set a routine. I took a sip of my coffee and smiled back. "Of course," I said. "You're right. I'll go pack." Every word was a lie, honey. But I needed time. I needed Emmett to get the paperwork ready. I had to be smart. That's what your mother's letter taught me. Don't just get mad. Document. Build your case. And then you strike. I left that afternoon and checked into a hotel just 3 miles away, far enough for him to think he'd won. It didn't take long. Vivian moved in just days later. Not right into the main house, but into the little guest cottage your mother used as an office. The place where she'd organized all her proof, printed those screenshots, and wrote me that letter. Vivian redid everything. New curtains, new bedding, flowers on the desk where your mom's laptop used to be. She told the nanny she was just helping Grant out. She told the neighbors she was a close friend. She told anyone who would listen that those babies needed a mother figure. What she didn't mention was that she'd been sleeping with their father for 3 years. The changes were so fast, so calculated. Within 3 weeks, Vivian was running the nanny's schedule, redecorating the living room, and taking down all the pictures of Colleen. She replaced them with cold, geometric art. Nothing that felt like a home. Nothing that said a family had ever been happy there. One evening, Jolene called me, her voice so tight. "Dot, you have to see this. Check Vivian's social media." So I did. Her account was public, of course. She wanted the world to see. The post was a picture of a tiny pair of baby shoes, white, with little yellow daisies stitched on them. My heart just fell. I knew those shoes. Those were Colleen's. I was with her when she bought them, 8 months pregnant and so excited. "These are the ones," she'd said. She bought 3 pairs, one for each of you, and there was Vivian, displaying them on a marble countertop, writing about how life gives you a second chance at family. I shut my phone and just sat on that hotel bed, my hands on my knees, breathing in and out, in and out. It felt like I was counting down the seconds to a detonation. The next morning, Emmett called with even worse news. He'd talked to the life insurance company. Grant had already put in the claim for $750,000. The policy was increased just 6 months earlier from $200,000. It needed Colleen's signature, but Emmett said it didn't match. He'd had a handwriting expert look at it. "It's not Colleen's," he said. "Forged," I whispered. It had to be. My daughter's life boiled down to a number, a fake signature, a payday for Grant's new life with that woman. "There's more," Emmett said. His accountant had gone through the USB drive. Grant had opened a secret company 18 months ago and had been funneling money into it. $320,000 from their joint account, in small amounts so no one would notice. 5,000 here, 10,000 there. And where did it go? He bought a condo downtown, a 2-bedroom. The title was in Vivian's name. I didn't say a word. He was also paying her $4,000 a month, calling them consulting fees. Then Emmett took a breath. Your mother's inheritance from her father, $85,000. Grant had moved all of it into that company 6 months ago, with no record of her agreeing to it. I opened my eyes and looked in the hotel mirror. A 61-year-old woman stared back with silver hair and lines around her eyes from a lifetime of laughter and loss. I was tired, so tired. But tired isn't the same as defeated. File it, I told him. File everything. Whatever it takes. I want custody of those babies. And I want Grant Ashford to pay for every single dollar he stole from my daughter. At the Triplets' 1-month checkup, I got there early. I had the authority, you see, as the emergency contact. I had all 3 of you in that big stroller Colleen had ordered. And just as I was at the front desk, the door opened, and in walked Vivian. Diaper bag, bottles, perfect red lipstick. She went right up to the receptionist and said, "I'm here for the Ashford Triplets." "I'm their stepmother," she announced. You could have heard a pin drop. All the other mothers in the waiting room looked up. The receptionist looked from me to her and back again. I didn't yell, darling. I didn't make a scene. I just reached into the stroller and lifted little Margot into my arms. She snuggled right up against my chest. "I have the appointment," I said calmly. "These are my grandchildren. I am their emergency medical contact. This woman is not their stepmother. She isn't their family, and she is not on any of their legal records." Vivian's perfect smile wavered for just a moment. "Grant sent me," she stammered. "He wanted me to be here." "Grant isn't here," I replied. "I am." And with that, I turned my back and walked Margot to the exam room. The nurse followed with Bridget and Theodore. Vivian was left standing there alone, holding bottles nobody needed. After the appointment, I drove to the cemetery. I walked across the damp grass to your mother's headstone. It was a simple one, gray granite, with the words, "Colleen Marie Ashford, beloved mother, daughter, friend." I sat right there on the ground next to it, not caring that the wet grass was soaking my pants. Someone had left lilies, always lilies. I pulled a little weed from the base and brushed the dirt from her name with my thumb. I thought about those words, mother, daughter, friend, all true, but they were missing one, warrior. That's what your mother was, a warrior who built a fortress of evidence with manila envelopes and USB drives. A warrior who fought quietly because the man she married made her believe that speaking up meant she was crazy. I stayed until the groundskeeper started making his rounds. I stood up, brushed myself off, and touched the top of her stone. "I found the envelope, Collie," I whispered. "I found everything, and I'm not going to stop." I walked back to my car. The sun was going down in shades of orange and pink, the colors your mother loved, the very colors she'd painted the nursery with. I started the car and drove back to that hotel. I ordered chicken soup from room service and ate every last bit. Then I called Emmett and told him to file the custody petition first thing in the morning. After that, I sat on the bed and took out my little notebook. I wrote down the date, what happened at the doctor's office, and exactly what Vivian had said. I wrote down the time and the names of the women who'd been in the waiting room. Then I closed it and put it on the nightstand right next to your mother's letter. 2 documents, side by side, one from her and one from me. Both building the same case, both fighting the same fight, both for the same 3 precious lives. Grant's lawyer, was named Whitfield Bradford Whitfield III, a name that just dripped with money, a name that had never known a real struggle. It wasn't some grand ballroom where everything shattered, but quiet, lonely places. A library parking lot after 10 at night. A hotel room with a tiny fridge and a giant broken heart. Whitfield, Grant's lawyer, he came at us with a restraining order. It claimed your grandmother was unstable, that her grief was out of control, and that she was getting in the way of Grant bonding with his own children. It was a cruel piece of paper, painting her as aggressive and irrational. And the worst part, Grant's own mother, Laurel Ashford, I can still see her, with her perfect hair and pearls. She signed a statement backing it all up. She called Dorothy hysterical, said she had no respect for boundaries, that she'd made a scene at the doctor's office. I read the whole thing in my office, door shut tight. I had to read it twice. It was a classic move, and I told Dorothy just that. They're trying to box you in, I said. Isolate you, make you look like the crazy one so no one will listen to you later. So what do we do? She asked me, her voice so small. I told her we fight back, but not on their terms. We'd file our own petition, of course, for grandparent visitation. But the real move, I explained, was to ask the court for a guardian ad litem for the babies. That's a special kind of lawyer, sweetie, one whose only job is to look out for the children. Not for Dorothy, not for Grant, just for those 3 little ones. On what grounds? She asked. I had a list ready. That Grant moved another woman into his home just weeks after his wife died. That this woman's old roommate was now the nanny. That his finances looked fishy. And most importantly, that Colleen's own writings showed she was worried about her children's future. There was a long silence on her end of the phone. All I could hear was the city outside her window, just going on, as if her world hadn't just stopped spinning. Then she said, "Do it." I also filed for a DNA test for the triplets. I told her it was just procedure, but looking back, I think she heard something in my voice. She asked me why, of course. Why the DNA? I had to be honest with her. The timeline of the affair, I said, it runs right alongside the fertility treatments. And I added something I'd learned over many years. Men who lie about where their money goes often lie about other important things, too. We had 3 weeks until the hearing, 21 days. Every single one of them was spent in that hotel room, watching, waiting, and building our case. Dorothy was amazing. She met with my forensic accountant, a brilliant woman named Patricia. Patricia spoke about money the way a poet talks about love. She laid out the whole ugly story for us. The shell companies, the hidden condo, the payments disguised as consulting fees, the forged signature. He built a castle out of paper, Patricia said. Looks strong, but the foundation is rotten. Then Jolene, Colleen's best friend, gave her statement. She talked about the last phone call, the strange post online about baby shoes. She described watching her friend, over 3 years, just fade. Go from this bright, funny person to someone who was always whispering, always apologizing. She changed, Jolene told me, and you could hear the regret in her voice. I should have pushed her to tell me what was wrong. I'll have to live with that, Dorothy's brother, Fletch. Even flew in from Portland. He checked into the room right next to hers, carrying a suitcase and a toolbox, of all things. He had this look in his eye that made you nervous, but he promised he wasn't there to cause trouble. I'm not leaving her side until this is over, he said, and he meant it. Those last few days before court were the heaviest. You could feel the tension in the air. Dorothy would just walk on the hotel treadmill every morning, not going fast, just walking, putting one foot in front of the other. It's how you get through things like that, I suppose. In the evenings, she'd read Colleen's pregnancy journal. I'd managed to get it from the house during a supervised visit. It was just a simple spiral notebook with a lavender cover. At first, reading it was like seeing Colleen smile on the page. Week 8. I heard their heartbeats today, 3 of them, or week 12. I'm sick all the time, but I don't care. I'd do anything to keep them safe. She wrote about picking names. Grant wanted something traditional. She wanted something meaningful. So they compromised. Margot, Bridget, and Theodore, Teddy. But then you could feel the shift in the entries. It was subtle at first. Week 20, Grant felt them kicked today. He cried. Maybe I was wrong. A little seed of hope. But then, week 22, he missed the ultrasound. He got a call and just left. I heard him say, baby, on the phone. He calls me Colleen, she wrote. But he calls her baby. After that, it was a cascade of heartbreak. Week 24, finding a gold earring in his car that wasn't hers. Week 26, him coming home, smelling of a perfume she didn't recognize. The expensive kind you buy for someone special. Then week 28, I hired an investigator, paid in cash. And week 30, the confirmation. Her name is Vivian Holloway. She's 29. They've been together for at least 2 years, maybe longer. When Dorothy finally put the journal down, she just rested her hand on the cover. You could almost feel the imprint of Colleen's pen, the pressure of her daughter's hand writing it all down, figuring out this terrible betrayal all by herself in the dark. Dorothy read me the last entry, from just 6 days before the babies were born. I'm not staying because I'm weak, Colleen wrote. I'm staying because I have 3 children inside me. And nowhere to go that he won't find me. But I'm getting ready. Every day, I'm getting ready. No one knows yet, but they will. Can you imagine that? She was putting together their nursery with one hand and building a case against her husband with the other, picking out blankets and hiding legal documents behind them. She was a warrior, fighting a battle on 2 fronts, and nobody even knew. She fought it in silence because he'd made her believe that speaking up would make her sound crazy. Dorothy closed the journal and set it on the nightstand, next to the other papers we'd found. A little stack of truth. She turned out the light and just lay there, listening to the hum of the hotel. She was thinking about the daughter, she remembered, the loud, funny girl who danced in the kitchen, and how that person had been slowly, deliberately erased, replaced by someone quiet and careful, someone who wrote everything down because she knew no one would believe her word against his. She pulled the covers up to her chin and just stared into the darkness. You were right, Collie, she whispered to the empty room. You were right about everything. I'm so sorry I didn't see it. The ceiling didn't answer, of course. There was just the hum of the heater and the muffled sound of a television down the hall. Your grandmother didn't sleep that night, but she rested. She knew she'd need all her strength for the day to come. The courtroom wasn't what you'd expect. Room 412, family court. The whole floor smelled like floor polish and old coffee, and the fluorescent lights made everyone look pale and tired. Dorothy wore a simple navy dress, one Colleen had picked for her a couple of Christmases before. In her purse, she carried Colleen's letter, folded and refolded. She never went anywhere without it. Then Grant arrived with his lawyer. He wore a dark suit, his hair was perfect. He looked like a man who'd gotten a full 8 hours of sleep without a single worry in the world. He gave Dorothy a little nod, so polite and controlled, like he was putting on a show for everyone. Behind him sat his mother, Laurel, with her pearls and her perfect hair. She didn't look at Dorothy, not once. She just stared at the judge's empty bench as if waiting for a play to start. Whitfield, the lawyer, spoke first. He was good. I have to give him that. He painted this picture of a devoted, grieving husband trying to raise 3 newborns all alone. He called Dorothy well-meaning but overbearing. I think he used the word overbearing 4 times, and boundaries 6 times. He made it sound like her grief had twisted her love into something ugly. It's the kind of smooth talk that costs $500 an hour. Then Laurel took the stand and said, Dorothy had never liked Grant and had always tried to run Colleen's life. You know, it's funny, the things that stick with you. I remember his lawyer trying to paint me as this monster, saying, I showed up at the hospital uninvited, that I was embarrassing, and technically, he wasn't lying, but it was the way he twisted it. That's what Grant's money paid for, I guess. Not outright lies, but a truth so bent, it pointed the wrong way. I just let them talk. Then Emmett, my lawyer, stood up. He had this quiet confidence. He told the judge he had proof of a different story, and then one by one, he laid it all out. The bank records, the hidden company, my daughter's stolen money, the condo bought for that woman. He even read the text messages. The one about being free after the babies came, that one still cuts deep. And then the whole courtroom just sort of held its breath. It felt like every person in there was connected by this invisible string, waiting. The judge asked me to speak. I remember standing up, looking at Grant, and when I tried to say the first word, my voice just gave out. I took a breath and started over. I told them my daughter was gone, that she had 3 babies who would never feel her arms around them, never hear her sing. The room was so quiet. I told them how the man who should have protected her moved his girlfriend into their home before the flowers on her casket even had a chance to wilt. How he stole from her, erased her from her own house, and then had the nerve to stand there and call me overbearing. I could feel my voice getting stronger then, clear and steady. I wasn't shaking anymore. I told the judge I was there because my daughter asked me to be, that she'd left me a letter and a promise, and I was going to keep it. The judge looked at me for the longest time. Then she looked at Grant and at all the proof Emmett had. She ordered the DNA test right then and there. She gave me visits with my grandbabies and threw out his restraining order. I saw this muscle jump in Grant's jaw. Just a tiny thing, but I saw it. Outside, your Uncle Fletch was a wreck. He couldn't be inside, so he was just pacing. When Grant walked out, Fletch went right for him. You killed my sister, he said. His voice was so low, so controlled, it was scarier than any yell. He said, you broke her heart so badly, her body just gave up. He told him about the money, the peace, the trust Grant had stolen. And now, the children. Grant just stood there, fixing his shirt cuffs like he was bored. He told Fletch that my Colleen was sick in the head, that the pregnancy made it worse, and that he was just trying to protect his family. He almost sounded convincing. I saw Fletch's hands start to shake, and I grabbed his arm. That kind of grip only a mother has. The one that says, not here, not now, hold on. Fletch took a step back, but he looked at Grant one last time and said, Colleen saw you. She saw through every lie, and she made sure the world would see it too. Grant didn't say a word. He just got in his car and sat there for the longest time without starting it. That night, in the hotel, was one of the hardest. I remember ending up on the bathroom floor. My legs just wouldn't hold me up anymore. I sat on that cold tile, holding Colleen's letter to my chest, and I whispered to her that I didn't know if I could do it. I felt 61 years old, fighting a rich man with an army of lawyers. I felt so weak. The light in there was so bright, you couldn't hide from anything. I looked in the mirror and saw myself, but for a second I saw something else too. I saw my eyes, but they were her eyes looking back at me. The same green, the same little tilt at the corners. It was like she was there. That's what got me back on my feet. I pushed myself up, stood tall, and splashed some cold water on my face. I even called the front desk and asked for extra towels. I didn't need them, of course. I just needed to hear another person's voice. The quiet in that room was deafening. It sounded like the silence in the hospital right after the doctor told us they'd done all they could. The young man at the desk was so cheerful. He said he'd send them right up and asked if I needed anything else. I just said no, thank you, and hung up. I sat on the bed and opened my notebook. I wrote down everything that happened that day. What the judge said, what Grant said, what Fletch said. Then I put my coat on and drove. I ended up at a 24-hour diner. You know the kind. Warm, smelled like coffee and bacon. A waitress with tired eyes but a kind smile took my order. I just wanted apple pie and black coffee. Your mom loved apple pie. We used to split a slice every Sunday. I sat in a booth and just watched the world. Truckers, nurses on their night shift, a young couple laughing over pancakes at 2 in the morning. I left a $40 tip on a $6 check and drove back with the windows down. The cold air felt good. It was a reminder that I was still here, still breathing, still in the fight. Those next 6 weeks, waiting for the DNA results, felt like a lifetime. I remember there were always 3 of everything. 3 little sleepers, 3 pairs of socks, 3 tiny hats. My whole world had become about the number 3. The call came on a Tuesday. I was folding baby laundry in my hotel room. I saw Emmett's name on the screen. He told me I needed to sit down. I sat on the edge of the bed, and a little sock with a yellow duck on it fell to the floor. Then he told me the DNA results were in. The silence on the phone was so loud. I could hear him breathing, could hear a clock ticking somewhere. The triplets, he said. And then he paused. Margot, Bridget, and Theodore. None of them are Grant's biological children. The whole room seemed to shift under me. It was like the floor, the walls, everything had moved just an inch. What did you say? I asked him. He repeated it, slow and clear. Not 1, not 2, but all 3 of them. The paternity test was 100% certain. Grant Ashford was not their father. I pressed my hand down on the hotel bedspread just to feel something solid, to make sure I was still there. How is that possible? I whispered. Emmett explained it all. How they'd been doing fertility treatments, how the clinic had flagged Grant's samples as unusable and recommended a donor. Colleen had signed the consent form. Alone, she knew. That was the first thought that came into my head. My daughter knew. Emmett confirmed it. She had agreed to use a donor, and she never told Grant. I remember asking Emmett why. Why didn't she just leave him? He told me he'd found a journal entry from around that time, and he read it to me. Your mother had written, "The doctor told me Grant's samples won't work. They recommended a donor." I said yes. I didn't tell Grant because he would have refused. He would have said his pride matters more than our family, and I want these babies more than I want his approval. Can you believe the strength that took? For the first time in my marriage, she wrote, I made a choice that was mine, just mine. Hearing that, it put all the pieces together for me. Your mother didn't have an affair. She made a difficult medical choice, all by herself. Because the man she married was too proud to accept that he needed help. His ego was more important than his family, and that was the man who was trying to get custody of 3 children who weren't even his biologically. Fighting for a life insurance payout that he had no right to. Model. You know, it's funny what people will believe when they want something to be true. When those DNA results first came out, Grant's whole case just fell apart. But for 48 hours, his girlfriend Vivian thought she'd won. She ran around telling anyone who would listen, "See? Colleen was the one lying. The babies aren't even his." She was so certain. But our lawyer, Emmett, he knew the real story was in the details. He explained how when Vivian heard the news, it was exactly what Grant's side was afraid of. Then, of course, the clinic records surfaced. The donor forms, the medical notes, all proving it wasn't some affair. It was your mother, making a deliberate, loving choice to build her family. And just like that, honey, the whole story flipped on its head. Colleen wasn't the one who had betrayed Grant. She was the one who built a family without him. She carried you 3 for 8 long months. Through a difficult pregnancy, all while she was getting the nursery ready and drawing little hearts on your ultrasound pictures. And she did it all knowing the man next to her was with someone else. You see, what destroyed Grant wasn't guilt, it was shame. His name, his pride, none of it was in you 3. I remember his mother, Laurel, called him. Her voice was pure ice. Those children are another person's problem now, she told him. Don't drag our name through the mud anymore. Then she hung up. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. He was cheating on the only one doing the real, painful work. I got a call that evening that I'll never forget, from your mother's doctor, Nina Prescott. Her voice was so quiet, so heavy with something she'd been holding onto. Mrs. Brennan, she said, your daughter told me something the week before she delivered, and I can't stop thinking about it. I just waited. The doctor continued. She said, if something goes wrong, make sure my mother gets the babies, not Grant, my mother. I told her it would be fine, and I was wrong. But I remember what she asked, and I'll say it under oath. When I hung up the phone, it was like I could hear Colleen's voice in that quiet hotel room, so clear and strong. I didn't need to turn on the light. I could see everything perfectly. Grant, of course, tried to spin his own story. He went on the local news, Channel 7, and sat down with a reporter who had that perfect, sympathetic nod. He sat in their living room, already cleared of your mother's pictures, wearing a nice shirt with no tie, trying to look like an honest man with nothing to hide. I loved my wife, he said, and the camera got a close-up of his eyes. They were just wet enough to look sad, you know? Not a real tear in sight. I thought we built a family together. Finding out the truth has been the most devastating experience of my life. When she asked about his affair, he just brushed it aside. I made mistakes, he said, but I never stopped believing I was those babies' father. He was always good at selling a story. That interview aired, and for about 48 hours, half the city felt sorry for him. But Grant miscalculated. He was used to controlling a room. But the internet isn't a small room you can manage. People started asking questions, smart questions, like why his girlfriend moved in just 2 weeks after the funeral, or why he was already filing for life insurance if he didn't know. Our lawyer, Emmett, he was brilliant. He just waited 3 days, let the questions pile up. Then, with my blessing, he released a few key pieces of evidence. The forged signature on the life insurance, the handwriting analysis proving it, and the bank transfers. $320,000 moved into a company that just happened to buy a condo for Vivian. The timeline showed the affair started before any of it. He showed them everything, right down to a single text message Grant sent Vivian 4 months before Colleen died. Once the babies are born and everything settles, it read, we will be free. She will sign whatever I put in front of her. She always does. After that, public opinion didn't just change, it crashed down on him like a wave. Women everywhere shared the story. Your mother became a kind of hero to them, the woman who protected her children, who fought her war in silence and won it even after she was gone. She was a symbol of strength. It was in the middle of all that, when the whole world was finally on her side, that Vivian decided to call Emmett. She came to his office on a Thursday. I remember Emmett telling me she looked like she hadn't slept for a week, her eyes all swollen. She looked like someone who had finally stopped pretending. And she told him everything. It turned out Grant was already texting another woman, a third one, named Danielle. The texts had started only 2 weeks after your mother's death, while Vivian was moving her things into the house, thinking she had won. I found the text on his phone, she told Emmett, the same way Colleen found mine, history repeating itself. Except I'm not pregnant and I'm not dead. She even had recordings of Grant on her phone, planning his next moves. She'd recorded Grant telling her how to lie about their relationship, explaining that he needed a woman in the picture for the custody hearing because judges have a soft spot for single fathers. He told her she'd decided she needed to be the mother you kids needed, not because he loved you or wanted to be a father, but because he needed her in the picture for his case. Just another prop, the same way he had used your mother to make him look like the man he wanted people to see. Emmett looked at her for a long time. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. I guess that's when it all came out. "I'm not a good person in this story," she said, "but I didn't know about the insurance or the forgery. I didn't know he was stealing from her." She pulled the ring he'd bought her right off her finger and set it on the desk. "I thought he loved me," she said. "I was wrong about that too." Emmett asked if she would testify, and she said yes, she'd do whatever was needed. When he told me all of this, I sat there for a long time. "I don't forgive her, Emmett," I finally said. "She slept with my daughter's husband. She moved into my daughter's home. I could never forgive that. But," I told him, "if she can help protect those babies, then I will accept her testimony. Your mother would have too. She was always practical. She would have used every weapon she had. And that weekend, I took you 3 to the park. It was the first time we had all gone out together. During my visits, I took the babies out. The triple stroller Colleen had ordered arrived 6 days after she was gone. The shipping tag was still on it, and I never took it off. I wanted that little paper tag with her name on it to stay right there. A receipt for a life she was supposed to live. I'd walk for hours, past the playground, around the pond, past the bench where we used to feed the ducks when she was a little girl. I tried not to think about court or Grant or all the legal mess. It was too much. But one day I heard a sound, a tiny, bright, startled laugh. The baby books said they were too young, but I heard it. It was like joy had been caught by surprise. I walked for 2 hours that day and didn't check my phone once. The final hearing was on a Monday, back in room 412. It had the same fluorescent lights, the same stale smell of coffee, the same cold tile floor. But the room felt completely different that day. Model. The air in that courtroom felt heavy, like right before a big storm hits. I remember I wore that navy dress again, the one Colleen had picked for me, and I had her old purse, the one with her monogram, DB. Tucked inside was her letter, and I found myself touching it through the leather before I sat down. It was a silly little habit, a way to feel like she was there with me. Grant showed up by himself, without that expensive lawyer of his. His new one looked young, nervous. Laurel, his mother, wasn't there either. After everything hit the news, the fraud, the affair, our family name, dragged through the mud, she'd stopped taking his calls. Emmett laid out the whole case, so careful and precise. The fake signatures, the hidden condo, all the money he took. It was all so organized, so... Colleen, I swear they must have learned how to build a case from each other. Every piece of paper was there. The DNA results, the clinic's records, even the consent form with only Colleen's signature on it. Vivian got on the stand, She was so calm, so clear. She didn't cry once, she just told the truth about the affair, the texts, and the recordings of Grant talking about how to manage me. She looked at the judge and said he never loved any of them. Not her, not Colleen, not the babies. He just loved the idea of his perfect life, and we were all just parts he was trying to fit into his story. When his story didn't work, he tried to write us out. Grant's new lawyer tried to question her, but it was no use. The proof was all there. Then Dr. Nina Prescott testified. She just repeated what Colleen had told her. If something goes wrong, make sure my mother gets the babies. Just hearing those words from someone else, it was powerful. My old friend Jolene testified too, about how Colleen had started to fade away, stopped calling, stopped coming to book club. She felt so guilty for not reaching out more. Then the guardian, the woman who'd been assigned to you kids, gave her report. She'd spent a month watching everyone, visiting my house, visiting Grant's. Her conclusion was simple. The children's best interests were with me. She said I had shown consistent, loving care, while Grant had shown, well, a pattern of lies. The judge took 2 hours to decide. 2 hours, honey. I just sat on a bench in that hallway, clutching my purse, and breathed. Fletch wore a path in the floor pacing. Jolene just sat next to me and held my hand. After all those years of friendship with Colleen, she knew our family didn't always need words. We just needed someone to be there. 34 years. That's a long time to know someone. When the bailiff called us back in, my heart was hammering so loud I could feel it in my feet. The judge sat down, put on her glasses, and started to read. In the matter of the custody of Margot, Bridget, and Theodore Ashford, she said, "This court finds as follows. I swear the whole world stopped right then. Full legal and physical custody is awarded to Dorothy Ann Brennan." I just closed my eyes. I didn't make a sound, just let the words sink in. Then she ordered Grant to repay every penny he'd stolen and sent the insurance fraud case to the district attorney. Grant just sat there like a stone. His lawyer whispered something to him, but he just gave this tiny little shake of his head. It was the gesture of a man who knew he was finally out of tricks. The judge said his medical license would be reviewed, and she denied his mother any visitation rights. Then she looked right at me. "Mrs. Brennan," she said, "your daughter left behind a remarkable record, not just of evidence, but of love." It was the first time I really let myself feel it. "This court is honored to fulfill her wishes," she said. I just nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." My voice didn't even shake. Outside, Emmett gave me another envelope. It was small and white, with Colleen's handwriting on it. For Mom. He said she'd given it to him weeks before you were born, with instructions to only give it to me after everything was settled. She told him I would need it then, not before. It felt so light in my hands, but the weight of it was something else entirely. I didn't open it there. I couldn't. I drove to the cemetery and sat on the little bench by Colleen's headstone. It was a warm spring day, and the daffodils were starting to push up through the dirt. Colleen always loved daffodils. She used to say they were proof that beautiful things could survive the cold. That's when I opened her letter. "Dear Mom," it said, "if you are reading this, it means the babies are safe, and you fought for them." She wrote that she should have told me everything sooner, but she was ashamed, not for using a donor, but for staying with a man who made her feel like it was a secret to be hidden. "These babies are mine," she wrote. "I chose them. I told them all about you, Mom. I told them you make the best apple pie and that you will love them fiercely, just like you loved me. I'm not afraid of dying," she wrote. "I am afraid of them growing up in Grant's shadow. That's why I built this paper trail." She said, "I was going to be tired, raising 3 babies at 61, but she knew I could do it. She remembered me working 2 jobs after Dad died, and never once missing a school play. You are the strongest person I have ever known," she said. "Tell them about me. Tell them I loved gardening and bad reality TV, and that I could never parallel park. Tell them I wanted them. Every single day, I wanted them. I love you, Mom. Now go be their whole world. Your Collie." I folded the letter back up so carefully, right on its original creases. Your mom was always so precise, even in a goodbye letter. I put it in my purse, and I've carried it with me every day since, not because I need to remember the words, but because it feels like holding her hand. I stood up and washed my face at one of those little water fountains they have there. I looked at my reflection and saw her eyes, my green eyes, looking back at me. I walked back to her headstone, and the wind was just starting to rustle the trees. I remember a bright red cardinal sitting on a branch nearby. "You saved them, Collie," I said out loud. "From your grave, you saved your own children." I rested my hand on the stone for a minute, then walked back to the car. Fletch and Jolene were there waiting. You three were in the back seat with a new nanny, a wonderful woman named Helen. I got in, buckled up, and looked in the rearview mirror. 3 little car seats, 3 tiny faces. And you, Margot, were awake, your big green eyes looking right at me. And I smiled. For the first time, and I don't know how long, it was a real smile. 6 months after that day, the house on Birchwood Lane felt different. Not in a big, dramatic way. It was more like how a garden changes with the seasons, slowly, naturally. The bones of the place were the same, but new life was everywhere. I repainted what had been her bedroom a soft yellow. It was Colleen's favorite color. It reminded her of daffodils. I kept all her furniture, but the new color on the walls felt like a fresh start. I put all of her pictures back up, every last one, all over the house, and then I started adding new ones. You 3 at 1 month, then 2, then 3. A whole new timeline, growing right alongside the old one. I remember those early days, like a slideshow of little miracles. Bridget's first real smile, Margot getting her first tooth, and Teddy, trying to grab a spoon. He had this look on his face, a seriousness you wouldn't believe. And the garden, that was your mother's sanctuary. I started watering it, not knowing the first thing about plants, but I found her gardening journal. It was like she was right there with me, telling me about soil and sunlight. When her rosemary made it through the winter, it felt like a little message of hope. As for Grant, well, his story took a different turn. He ended up with probation and a big fine, his career completely over. All those fancy brochures with his name on them just became old news. His mother, Laurel, cut him off. Not out of sympathy for Colleen, you understand, but because she was horrified. The whole mess had tarnished the family name, and for Laurel, her reputation was as vital as air. Her son had turned their name into gossip. Vivian, she just vanished. She sold the condo Grant had bought using Colleen's money, and all of it went back to us. She moved away, trying to start over, I suppose. I got one text from her months later, just saying she was sorry. I never wrote back, but I never deleted it either. It was a funny thing, a reminder that people are complicated. The woman who helped ruin my daughter's life also helped save my grandchildren. Then there was Dr. Nina Prescott. She started coming by every couple of weeks, officially to check on the babies with her charts and questions. But she always brought soup and stayed for coffee. We'd sit at the kitchen table and just talk, about books or the weather or her own mother that she missed so much. We became such good friends, the two of us. It's funny how life brings people together. And Jolene, bless her heart, she was our Sunday morning ritual. She'd show up at 9 sharp with bagels from that little shop where she and Colleen always went. She'd bring 3 kinds of cream cheese, plain for me, everything for Fletch, and strawberry, always strawberry, because that was your mother's favorite. Then she'd read to you all, doing all the different voices. The bear was deep and rumbly, and the mouse was a tiny squeak. And her narrator voice was so gentle, Teddy would let out this surprised little laugh every single time, this burst of pure happiness. I remember one time, Jolene was holding Bridget, and told you all, your mother would have done this so much better. She was trying so hard to do the voices right, just for Colleen. Then Fletch, he built that treehouse in the backyard. It took him 3 whole weekends. He wasn't building it for you 3 as babies. You couldn't even sit up yet. He was building it for the future. For when you'd be old enough to climb and dream and share secrets up there. A place to be a little closer to the sky and closer to your mom. He even put a little plaque on the door. Oh, your grandfather Fletch carved that sign for the treehouse, the Collie House. He showed it to me one Sunday, and I remember just standing there in the backyard, looking up at it. The green paint was so bright against the oak branches, and the sun just caught the wood. She would have loved it, I told him. And he just said, she would have said the paint was uneven. I laughed then, a real deep laugh, the kind I thought I'd lost for good. But there it was, warm and surprising, proof that you can still find joy after the deepest sorrow. In the evenings, after you 3 were asleep, I'd move Colleen's rocking chair right into the middle of the nursery. I had to, so I could reach Margot on the left, Bridget in the middle, and Teddy on the right. That chair, Colleen found it at a yard sale. She sanded it down, put on 3 coats of white stain, and sealed it. I can still smell the lemon oil she used on all her projects, the kind that cost $1.50 a bottle at the hardware store. I'd just sit and rock, and the chair would make this soft creaking sound, like a heartbeat. It was old and steady, just doing what it was meant to do. I'd look at your 3 cribs, with the little mobiles of stars and moons she'd picked turning over your heads. She had ordered those 3 star-shaped nightlights, too. They showed up 2 days after the funeral, and I plugged them in myself, casting that soft yellow glow on the ceiling. Margot, you were always a stomach sleeper. Didn't matter what the book said. You'd flip right over. You were stubborn, determined, just like your mother, Bridget. You slept perfectly still on your back, like a little soldier, your eyes dreaming away, even at just 6 months old. I used to wonder what babies dream of. Warmth, I suppose. And milk. And Teddy, you always curled up on your side with your fist by your mouth. You were the quiet one, so patient. You'd wait for your bottle, you'd wait your turn to be held. You'd wait for Margot to finish her cooing and Bridget to stop her fussing, and then you'd make your own little sound. It wasn't a cry, just a quiet little, I'm here now. I'd rock and just watch you all breathe. It's funny, looking back. I knew people saw our story as a tragedy. A young mother gone, a cheating husband, a whole scandal. But that wasn't the real story, not the one that mattered. The real story was about your mother, who loved you all so much she built you a life raft before the ship even started sinking. She gathered her proof, organized everything, changed her will, wrote letters. She prepared for the absolute worst while she was painting your name plaques and singing to her belly that held 3 perfect beating hearts. The real story is about a mother who fought her last battle in silence, and from beyond the grave, she won. I remember getting up from that chair and walking to the window. The backyard was dark, the treehouse just a shape against the big oak. I picked up that purple marker from the windowsill. I'd found it in her desk. It was the same one she'd used to draw little hearts on your ultrasound picture. Such a deep, rich purple. I took off the cap and drew a little heart on the wall by Margot's crib, then one next to Bridget's and one next to Teddy's. 3 little, imperfect hearts. A grandma's hand isn't as steady as a mother's, But they were there, permanent purple, on those soft yellow walls. I put the cap back on and left the marker right there. I thought you kids could use it someday, when you were old enough to draw your own hearts. The clock said 11:45. A new day was almost there. I knew I should sleep, that in a few hours, 3, 6, 6-month-olds would be up, wanting their bottles and all my attention at 5:30 sharp, and I was ready to give you the full force of my love. All of it. Every morning, every night, every bottle, every diaper, every first step, and bad dream. I would give you everything because that's what your mother asked of me, and because that's just what I do. I started to hum that old lullaby I sang to Colleen, the one my mother sang to me, and the one Colleen sang to you for 9 months. Just a simple melody, passed down through 3 generations of women. No words, just the sound of love, humming through time. You all slept, the nightlights glowed, and the house was so peaceful. Outside, the first stars were coming out over the treehouse, with its cedar sign and its green paint, holding a promise of laughter that would come one day. I suddenly had 3 of everything. 3 mouths to feed, 3 futures to watch over, 3 hearts beating because Colleen's had stopped. And I, Dorothy Brennan, at 61 years old, was exhausted and silver-haired and so fiercely, completely, stubbornly alive. I wouldn't have traded a single one of you, not for anything in this world, not for anything in the next. And that's the one truth this story taught me, sweetheart. Love doesn't end just because a heart stops beating. A mother's love builds walls that outlast her. It writes letters that speak after she is gone. It protects children she will never get to hold again. If this story moves you, if it makes you feel something real, then I hope you remember that. Remember that a woman's strength matters, and that some stories, they deserve to be told so that we never, ever forget what's important. Thank you for listening to this old woman ramble on. You are the reason these memories stay so bright. Our family worked hard to turn our pain into a meaningful story with a valuable lesson. I think every character in a family's life contributes to the tales they'll tell one day, creating something just for the heart, just for inspiration. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.